Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Dan and Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
Well, Joe, we're fresh off what I think, at least for us, was a very surprising outcome for the national championship game, the finale between Bama and Georgia. And I'm sure everyone watching right now sees that I'm unfortunately wearing a Georgia shirt right now. And it's because Joe and I made a bet during the bowl season. It's the second time we've done this, and the loser has to wear some attire of their hated rival. This year, I decided that Georgia was my most hated rival. It kind of switches in my mind between Alabama and Georgia. I just kind of thought I'd go Georgia this year. Last year, Joe lost, and of course, he wore, I believe it was a Mississippi State hat. But this came in handy because on Monday night, I actually watched the championship game with a friend of the show, Kyle, who's a big Georgia fan, hence where the shirt came from. And me, being the great friend that I am, actually wore this shirt during the game, cheering for the Bulldogs because I did cheer for Alabama back in 2017, but I just really felt like Georgia was due. And frankly, I just couldn't stand the thought of Alabama winning another national championship. So this time I opted to cheer for Georgia. And boy, was I rewarded. And I think that really the only reason Georgia won is because I committed this selfless act and wore this shirt.
You definitely should take credit for that. I kind of felt the same sentiment. I felt like if Alabama won this year with kind of an underwhelming team, it would just be very frustrating because this was a great Georgia roster. And I mean, Alabama's a great chance to be back next year. Obviously, Georgia will be a factor as well. But I felt like if Alabama won this year, it was almost like they would have stolen, an extra title.
Well, I absolutely think so, Joe. I mean, we're going to go through this later, but I think this is one of the least talented teams that Saban has had. And I mean, I think it's been said ad nauseum by a lot of people, but I think it might be Saban's best coaching job that he even got this team to the championship game.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
I mean, you want to look at all the close calls they had. I mean, it started at the beginning of the season with a 2-point win over Florida because Florida missed an extra point and missed a 2-point conversion. And, that time everybody was saying, well, look at Florida. What a great atmosphere in the swamp, yada, yada. Florida's continuing what they did last year. Look how they're trending up with Dan Mullen. And then we know what happened the rest of Florida's season. It started with a disaster against Kentucky with 200 yards and penalties. And it ended with Dan Mullen not even coaching against Florida State because he'd already been fired by that point.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just the first one. I mean, of course, they lose to Texas A&M, and Jimbo breaks the hex that no former Saban assistant can ever beat Nick Saban. That would be a Texas A&M team that had already lost to Mississippi State and Arkansas in back-to-back weeks. And then they go down, they almost lose to Arkansas themselves. They play a game against LSU where, frankly, they should have lost. It's just LSU wanted to lose more than Alabama did. And then a couple weeks later, they play in the Iron Bowl in a game that Auburn controlled for 3.5 quarters. They just didn't have the killer instinct this year and never put Alabama away. And of course, Bryce Young had his Heisman winning drive where he tied it up to make it 10-all. And of course, they got the win in overtime with Mechie doing his Karate Kid celebration. And then we lead into this SEC championship game where I think I went on the show saying I thought Georgia was going to curb stomp them and beat them like 31-13 or somewhere in that range. And Alabama was the one who did it and completely shocked us. And they looked so dominant in that game and then very consistent in the next win over Kentucky that I still actually picked Alabama to beat Georgia, even though, to be honest, that was only I picked Alabama to win Georgia in hopes that me picking it out there would cause Alabama to lose, which it did. Thank you very much. But that all goes to say that I thought Saban's coaching job this year was excellent. And you could see it even with the way he treated his players. Normally, you'll see Saban get mad when they win by 30 points or something and call out individual players for performances, for errors. This year, he'd have games where they didn't play very good, like the Iron Bowl, and he would congratulate their grit and determination and talk about, what a great effort they gave to win this game when the chips were stacked against them. And he definitely was doing a lot more positive reinforcement this year than I've ever seen. And apparently it was necessary because his team needed every bit of his coaching wisdom this year.
No, absolutely. And in many ways, when I watched the playoffs and everything kind of culminate, Kirby Smart on the sidelines kind of felt more like Nick Saban, with him kind of getting frustrated with the offense at times. Like he really kind of blew up. I remember at the end of the first half of the Orange Bowl, he got mad at Stetson Bennett for not managing the clock correctly. And so that was in the midst of a huge lead against Michigan. So I saw him more like his mentor. But yeah, I guess that was voted well for Georgia, in this game, preparing for this game. And yeah, you give a lot of credit to Saban, but at the same time, Georgia finally kind of gets that monkey off their back, kind of that, animal of trying to finally get over the hump with Alabama. And for a while, Dan, it was a close game. You think about how Alabama had the lead in the second half when they went up, 18-13, like Georgia had to get pretty, concerned at that point.
Yeah, Joe, you were talking about how Alabama was looking really good in the second half, especially when the controversial Stetson Bennett fumble play happened. And what a turning point in the game that was, because there was so much psychologically going on that play. You think about it, Georgia has the lead. They've started to get a lot of the momentum. Their defense is playing out of their minds. They've had Alabama's been in the red zone 5 times and has had 10 points, I think, at that juncture of the game, or 11 points. Or no, it was 12 points because it was 13-12. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And, just held them to field goals every single time. And then, of course, there have been the blocked field goal. And this play happens. And, I think everybody thought it was an incomplete pass at first. I know I did when I first saw it. And then my mind switched to, well, if it isn't an incomplete pass, there's no way this guy recovered it in bounds, right? it just looks so lackadaisical. And then when you saw the replay, in my mind, I think the other foot was touching, because it was like he didn't really have control of the ball when his foot was really on the ground, the one that maybe was on the line. You weren't sure to begin with. And then the other foot came down. And what it came back to in my mind is the very first play of the game. Bryce Young got stripped, and it was a recovery for a touchdown. And they said that his arm was moving forward, when if you looked at it, it looked like Jordan Davis had such a strong arm on Bryce's arm. He actually moved it forward. I don't even think that Bryce Young threw that. I think that was Jordan Davis actually controlling his arm, trying to wrench it free. And so I thought they made the wrong call by overturning that one to begin with, because in my mind, I didn't see indisputable video evidence that was an incomplete pass. I thought that was actually just such a strong tackle that it kind of made an illusion right there. Yep. And now you go to this play, and in my mind, I'm like, okay, so these guys obviously tend to side on the incomplete pass. So I thought they're just going to rule this an incomplete pass. And if they do not rule it an incomplete pass, there's no way they can rule that Alabama actually recovered this fumble. And when they did all these things, I was like, well, sorry, Kirby, the refs aren't going to let you win this game, because they're so incredibly inconsistent. In my mind, either both of those are fumbles or both of those are incomplete passes. You can't have one be one way and one be the other way.
Yeah, no, I had a huge problem with that too. In that first play for Bryce Young, I thought that changed the entire complexity of the game.
Oh, yeah.
Georgia recovered that. Maybe it's a blowout. Maybe it's a Georgia rout. And it kind of kept Alabama in the game for a long period of time.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think you're right, Joe. I think had that play stood and Georgia had that fumble recovery for a touchdown, this may have been the kind of beatdown that I talked about happening in the SEC championship.
It easily could have been. And, on the flip side, in the second half, to your point about the Stetson Bennett play, yeah, I thought that, gave Alabama a prime opportunity to capitalize, get that touchdown, go ahead. And then suddenly with that gift touchdown, Georgia fans are feeling like, it's the same narrative over and over again. It's just another collapse.
Joe, I was with the Georgia fan, and he and I were thinking kind of the same thing, that at that point, not only do we think Georgia was going to lose, we thought they'd probably lose by 10 or 15 points themselves at that point. But, I give a lot of credit to Stetson Bennett. He did not play a good game. In my mind, I thought that was a little bit you going for a hokey Disney story by giving him offensive MVP, because let's be honest, he really didn't play that great of a game. But what he did do, though, is he recovered from this mistake very well. That next drive, he makes a couple clutch throws. including a great one in the end zone to Donnie Mitchell. Although I would argue that was a better catch than it was a throw, because that really was just an excellent touchdown catch by him. But you can't argue with the fact that after Stetson Bennett had that fumble, he went 4 for 4 for 86 yards and 2 touchdowns. And
Yeah,
so, he did. He made a very tough move. He showed the reason that he had that starting job, which is he's very mentally tough. There's a lot of athletes, in fact, maybe 99% of athletes who would have wilted at that point with all the pressure that he had on them, with people saying, including us for weeks, that JT Daniels should have been in there. And then he makes this mistake, which frankly would have cost his team the game, especially the way their defense is playing. And he recovered and he did some really good things. He showed a lot of composure. And then I really thought that not only, if you were going to give an offensive MVP, I know you can't do this. I really thought that Todd Monken's play calling was excellent, especially at the very end. The touchdown that he had to Brock Bowers, that screenplay, that was what I thought was the best play call of the entire game.
Yeah, that was really good. And to your point, I think that one reason he won the award, in addition to the storyline, is you just did not have, a player from the skill position offensively that stood out for Georgia. Like, everybody kind of was in the middle of the pack. Bowers didn't have a huge game receiving. He had the one touchdown reception that you referenced. And so I think that that's one reason they gave it to Bennett on top of the storylines, obviously. But just a couple of other thoughts I had about the game, kind of watching the fourth quarter. I think it was definitely just unbelievable brilliance how Bennett, came back from the adversity of the turnover. That would have cost Georgia the game. But a couple of other things I thought about, Dan. First and foremost, on the drive where Bryce Young threw the pick six, I really felt that Alabama tried to force it there too much. They went too fast. They had plenty of time, and I want to say 2 or 3 timeouts, and they had no reason to just throw it up for grabs there. I felt like they could have been more methodical and taken like 10 or 15-yard shots. It kind of reminded me of in the NFL the day before, where Matthew Stafford, to our frustration, threw the interception against the 49ers on a 1st and 10 play with like a minute and a half to go. I'm like, why force it? You got plenty of time, and Bryce Young forced it, and, Georgia capitalized.
Yeah, Joe, I was thinking the same thing. I mean, at that point, I believe there was like 2 minutes left on the clock. They had all 3 timeouts, and they don't have any of their deep threat playmakers. Of course, one of the biggest plays in the game was when Jamison Williams tore his ACL, and you already had Mechie, who had tore his ACL in the SEC championship game. And suddenly all of your guys that you can send deep aren't there anymore. Ja'Cory Brooks is there, which he's had some moments where he shined, but he's not exactly a guy that you want to throw the ball to at that juncture against, Georgia's secondary, which had a really good game. And meanwhile, what had been the strength of Alabama's passing game and during that one? It was the tight end. It was Cam Latu. It was Slade Bolden. Slade Bolden had a good game. These are not guys that you're sending on 40-yard routes. These are guys that are better in the 10, 15 intermediary passing, and they had plenty of time to do passes like that. So I'm in complete agreement with you. I thought that was definitely forced and a little too aggressive.
Yeah, it seemed like the type of play you would throw like out of desperation if you had like a 4th and 15 type opportunity.
Yeah, and, it was so interesting about that game is Keely Ringo gets that pick, and you can see Kirby running next to him trying to tell him to get down because I guess he wanted to run the clock out. And all Keely Ringo could see was pay dirt right there and took it home, which it was funny. I bet the over on that game, and I didn't think there was any way I was going to reach it the entire game. It seemed like the odds were against me. And when he had that pick six, suddenly they were at 51 points, and I was only 1.5 points away from clearing the over-under. And I was like, wait a minute, I can actually win this because now all they got to do is score a touchdown on this last drive for Alabama. And then, of course, they get sacked at the end and get nothing, and which shows why I should never bet on Alabama games ever. But I mean, just what an amazing play. And it almost was kind of fitting that you got to see a 60-yard pick six to seal it for Georgia, because Georgia fans got to have like 10 seconds watching this play where they got to realize that all their dreams were finally going to come true right then and there.
Right. No, absolutely. I saw like a lot of videos of reactions from Georgia fans for that play. It's kind of like, our version of the Tracy Porter interception in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, exactly. It's one where you're playing a team that you think you're good enough to beat, but that they just you just don't know that you're going to get over that hump.
Hmm.
And a lot of things have gone against you, and then that play happens, and suddenly it seals the deal. And of course, I thought it was so fitting that the game-winning play would be something made by their defense, because I love the story of Stetson Bennett. There's going to be movies made about him. He's probably going to give motivational speeches, but at the end of the day, the reason they won the national championship was because of that excellent defense they had.
Oh, no doubt. Just a fantastic defense. It's going to be interesting to see next year without Dan Lanning how they do, and also compelling to see how Oregon and Georgia will do in the I think the season opener next year.
Yeah, that is going to be really interesting that Dan Lanning, leaves Athens to go to Oregon, and then his first game is going to be against his old team, and most of which can be all players they've recruited. And it'll just be fascinating. He'll probably know more players on his old team than his new team by the time they play each other.
Absolutely.
But, one thing I want to say, though, is I really was impressed with the way that, like I said, with all the cards against them, with Alabama not having any of the receivers, they did hang in there in this game, and they had a good chance at the end. And this Georgia team was not only the superior team on the field, mentally they showed they were superior by overcoming what was a huge body blow on that fumble play, and then Alabama's only touchdown inside the red zone to follow.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. Yeah, I mean, a lot of resilience there by that team. A lot of teams would have folded. It was just kind of getting through that psychological factor. And then the crazy thing I had kind of as a final takeaway, Dan, from this game is I think I saw a statistic that this was the second most lopsided loss for a Saban team, but still only 15 points. Is that right? Like the second most lopsided loss at 15 points?
I mean, I guess the only one that's more than it was the Clemson national championship game where Clemson beat them 44-16. I mean, I could see how that's possible. I did hear an even crazier stat, though, Joe, that apparently Saban had not lost a game where he was leading at halftime and then lost the game by double digits. So you were leading at halftime and then ultimately lose the game by double digits since he was Michigan State's head coach in 1995, where they were beating Ohio State in the first half, and then Ohio State ended up beating him by double digits. Like, what a crazy stat that is.
No, that is. And it also really surprised me looking at the statistics. Like, I'd have to look back at that first year he was at Alabama in 07, but I would have thought, there would have been some games that year, if my memory was correct, that would have been more lopsided, some of the losses.
That's right. But, looking forward, Alabama is going to have a great team coming back next year. I think we probably put them as the preseason number one. And what remains to be seen is Kirby going to be a one-trick pony, or does he bring additional championships to Athens? Right now, I would definitely lean towards the latter. I think he's recruiting at such a high level. He seems to definitely have it year in, year out, where they're one of the more talented teams. And now he's shown that he can get over that biggest hurdle. So I think the sky's the limit for him now.
I think so. I mean, there'll still be, pressure, but I think that it's a different kind of pressure now. And, the expectation will be the same, but, he's definitely realized the potential now.
That's right, Joe. And the last thing that I wanted to say is there was one sequence I feel like that really changed the game completely, though. So we talked about how Georgia's defense, 5 times that Alabama was in the red zone, held them to field goals on 4 of those occasions. The only time they scored the touchdown was right after the Stetson Bennett questionable fumble.
Yeah.
Alabama has first and goal, I think, inside the 10. Bryce Young misses a wide open receiver in the end zone due to pressure. And the next play, he gets sacked for about a 15-yard loss. Georgia blocks the field goal. And then it's the next play, James Cook busts out, and I think it was like a 75-yard run to get Georgia inside the red zone. And that's Georgia gets some points right there. And these plays all happen like one after another. And I think, Georgia actually they did get a touchdown there. Zeus White got a 1-yard rushing touchdown right there. So Georgia gets his first touchdown after this. And it's just a crazy 4-play cycle right there. You go from incomplete pass, proven a touchdown, sack, So 5 plays, blocked field goal, rushing to 80-yard run, and then a rushing touchdown. And all this happens in this quick instance right here. And suddenly Georgia goes from possibly being down 15-6 to being up 13-12.
Yeah, that was definitely a bizarre sequence, and I think a very underrated sequence. You didn't really hear as many people concentrate on that. More people were concentrating on probably the pick six and some other plays in the game.
That's right. But, I mean, that was a huge play in this game. And, it just shows, like I said, a lot of resiliency on this Georgia team. And even though Georgia is sometimes my most hated rival, I was happy to see it because they had earned it. They had been there so many times. And actually, in our next segment, I thought it'd be fun. Joe and I are going to talk about what we think are the best Alabama teams under Saban to not win the national championship and what we think are the best Georgia teams since that 1980 national champion that for so long had been their last championship to not win it. So these could include some Kirby Smart teams, might include some Mark Richt teams, but no one else because really none of the other Georgia coaches after Dooley did that much. But these two guys, we have a long period of time where Georgia has had many chances to put their chips in the middle of the table, but it always came up black. And this time they won it and got the championship. So now we're going to talk about some of those failures in our next segment in the fun locker room talk. And
sounds good.
Yeah. And if you want to listen to this and then all world episodes, they're all going to be on Spotify. Look up the Dan and Joe Sports Show on there. We have our own YouTube channel, the Dan and Joe Sports Show YouTube channel. You can follow us at DJ Sports Show. And of course, you can also like our Facebook fan page. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.